We've been lucky at our larger 6-acre site to have had a break from deer browse for a little bit. I think the brush wall that we put around the perimeter helped to deflect some new deer friends from finding this landscape. But this spring, it feels as though a number of deer have found out about this little deer magic land and have been coming in and really hurting plants this spring. What I want to talk about in this video are some observations around what seem to be in the shrub and tree layer, the cane shrub and tree layer, some of the plants that we've found over the years that even though a ridiculous amount of deer browse might be happening, they're still able to grow with no problem. So this will be a deer resilient plant identification video. And for reference, for those of you that work in landscapes with lots of deer, this will be a familiar sight. But just to give a sense of the intensity, they are chewing on pretty much everything. So this is Japanese honeysuckle. They normally don't chew on those. They're even chewing on, well, they're chewing on all the ash trees. So all the regrowth of these ash trees is being really suppressed quite a bit. They're seeking them out preferentially. They're eating the tops of valerian plants this year. They've eaten the tops off of almost all of our Carpathian walnuts. It's been a very intense uptick in deer pressure. So who are the characters that can handle that? And the good news is there are a bunch. So we are in central New York, zone 5B, 6A, 7A-ish. We're starting to warm up here. Very wet spring. And in this landscape for the last 15 years or so, I've been developing all these different tree systems and shrub systems. And some characters over all those years just never seem to be bothered by deer that much. I want to put an asterisk on this and say this is just my own subjective take. You know, your planting may vary, your deer populations may vary, but let's look at some in the lower layer first. Coming into a woodland thicket here, we documented this area a bunch of years ago. My gosh, it might have been like 8 years ago now. But this is a black currant production thicket. It's about a 1/8 of an acre, a 1/16 of an acre glade, fully exposed to all of the deer browse in this landscape. In fact, you can see where they're coming through and hitting back some of these juglans. This is the first year where they've really gone hard on black walnut, English walnut. Anyway, lots and lots of browse through here, quite obviously. And these characters, the black currant, we've talked about this a number of times. It always reminds me just how wonderful these plants are, how resilient they are in shade, in moisture, in understory, and in competition. Here they are growing under an ever-increasing bitternut hickory. And with all of this deer browse through this area, yes, they get nibbled here or there, but for the most part, they're left unaffected. It's really magical. So this happens to be a block of titania doing its thing, and then this is a block of crusader, just another named variety of blackcurrant. Same picture, the deer can move through here as much as they want. They probably bed down in here as well, and sometimes they'll nibble the tips in the winter, but they leave them pretty much alone. It seems as though red currant and white currant enjoy the non-interest of the deer as well. Here's a really dense patch of red currants with wild blackberries coming up through them. The blackberries actually get chewed by the deer more than the currants do. This is a particularly wild, super thorny blackberry, and so they get a little less browse. We let them be here because it's a great wild fruit. Makes it hard to pick the currants, but whatever, we can work with these situations. And then last but not least, the yasta berry. So here you can see they're getting chewed. That's definitely deer browse from this season, but it's not as intense. It's not like an apple or a chestnut or a hazelnut where they just keep pounding them unendingly until they really sometimes pass away from the browse. Two other characters I wanted to mention that happen to just be in this same glade. One is the gumi, so that's this friend right here. This is a cousin to autumn olive. Autumn olive also seems to be extremely uninteresting to deer. So gumi and autumn olive seem to escape deer browse. They get browsed by rabbits in the winter, so it's a whole other design parameter to think about. But for the most part, gumi, if you want to be on the careful side, the thoughtful side around spreading plants, gumi does really well with unending deer browse. And you can see cultivar canopied autumn olive to the north of this glade providing nitrogen, also escaping deer browse. And here's pawpaw, another keystone character. If you have black walnut, if you've got rich, shady, moist soil and you've got tons of deer browse, pawpaw should be in your landscape. These trees, wherever we plant them, seem to escape browse. They'll get rubbed by bucks once in a while, and that can be devastating to a given tree, but they don't get that incessant, unending browse from deer that can really just have plants succumb. And this is a very productive plant in the landscape. You can see there's about 5 tiny fruits there, 3 or 4 over here, another 4 here, 5 here. There's probably about 15 or 20 just in this one little tiny spot, and then more throughout. You'll want to plant a thicket of them for really good pollination. We just have them dotted everywhere throughout the landscape, so wherever the random ones are, they get pollination. The most characters in ribes, so the black currant in particular, to some extent red, white, pink currant, yasterberry a little bit, gooseberry seems left alone. Just absolute, to my mind, keystone elements for that low layer in a deer exposed space. I wouldn't put blueberries, I wouldn't put honeyberries where the deer browse, but these little canes do so beautiful, and they're just nice to tuck in the woods too. They can grow under the pawpaws next to the gumi, providing nitrogen to everybody, and the deer can be a super highway and pretty much be left alone, at least in our landscape. Tell me otherwise if you know something different. A little higher up in the canopy, this is somebody that it's a pleasant surprise to me that this is the case. This is an American plum, a wild American plum. There's a thicket of them here. In fact, there's 3, and then that pattern repeats all throughout in here. So there's plum, there's autumn olive, there's hazelnut, and there's bamboo, and there's pawpaw all through here. You wouldn't know it because it's just basically a woodland, but that is a food forest. But here, these plums over time have just moved their way up through the browse. So whatever amount of browse that the deer are conferring onto these plums as they're growing and getting established does not seem to be higher than the rate of growth for these trees. They don't have fencing. I didn't think to fence them. I just planted lots and lots out. And there they are. Maybe the deer are cleaning up some of the lateral branches, but that's all right. It just makes it easier to get in there. So they've got lots of little fruits starting to form. Looks like a good year. They finally have their pollination stuff happening in this landscape. So we'll grow a lot more of these from seed. Plum seems like a nice winner, and it seems pretty shade tolerant. They're tucked in here too and doing their work. Quick side note that I'd like to explore, and I'd love to get feedback from folks in the comments around willow. So it's not exactly a food. It's a very useful plant in the landscape, but by and large willow can be just wailed on by deer for the most part. But we found one subset of the willow clan that seems to be left alone. Let's take a look. So right next to a waterway here, we've got yasterberry growing, there's water, and then there's willow. This was planted as a cutting a bunch of years ago. It's got autumn olive to the north, providing nitrogen and feeding them. But what you'll notice is that with all the deer browse on everybody else, the ash, the oaks, the maples, the honeyberries, the blueberries, the pears, these are not getting browsed, at least not enough to be a problem. In fact, here's another willow doing the same thing. What's unique about these, I can't remember the exact cultivar name, they're either Oka or Koryonagi, but they are Salix purpurea. They are in the basket willow making clan. And I remember reading about this, I guess the tannin levels in basket making willows, or anything that's Salix purpurea family, tends to be tannic enough to avoid the desire of deer. And once they're tall like that, it's a moot point. They're above deer browse. But all of that new succulent growth in there should be getting wailed on, but it's not. There's a little bit of nibble. It's like they're testing them, they're sampling them, but they're not coming back and eating more. If this was apple, every single bit would be chewed down to nothing. If this was ash, it would just be like nuggets of bites down. So Salix purpurea, as a little side note for your wet contexts that are deer exposed, might be something thoughtful to add in. Here's this nice pond that we planted in the middle of the woods here a bunch of years ago, holding water pretty nicely. This berm was planted out in the spirit of an understanding through observation of those plants that seem to have no problems from deer. And so I can just rattle off who's going on in here. A little bit of herbaceous stuff in this section. Tansy, never seen an issue with them. Senna is another herbaceous plant. Anybody in the mentha family. So we've got our bee balm. So this is Monarda fistulosa actually. And then again, since we know that currants do well, these are pink currants through here that are doing just fine. Rhubarb never seems to be bothered by deer. And then we went pretty hard with gumi. That's the whole edge of this pond. And even though elderberry gets chewed on by deer pretty intensely, it's a little bit hard for them to chew on it when it's on a really steep slope leaning over the water. So we planted this out aiming over the water to keep the deer off them, and it seems to work actually well enough. This whole section in here is thriving with deer moving through with such intensity. For example, here's an ash tree that the deer pretty much ripped apart recently. They cracked the branches in the pursuit of pulling leaf material off of here. So with that level of intensity, there could be a good many deer at a time that are coming through here, and what they do want to eat, they are eating. So it's not as though it's sheltered and protected and intermittent. This is full-on deer exposure. Goji berry seems to be a plant that the deer don't go for. Why? I don't know. Maybe it's a little bit like belladonna or some of the other solanaceous plants that are poisonous to deer. But all through this berm, there are goji berries growing, and the rabbits nibble them a little in the winter. But all this new succulent growth, you'd think if the deer wanted them, it's right here, they could do it. They don't eat it. Got a plum growing here, which I just mentioned a little ways back. And then another character to consider, this is American persimmon, which is a northern cold hardy persimmon. No fence around this. It grew right up through the deer browse. Now it's up in the canopy. The deer do nibble them a little bit here or there. In fact, here's another persimmon right in front of me. And some of the tipwood the deer will nip here or there, but by and large they grow right on through it. So just to confer a little more protection to this persimmon, you can see I added black currant at the time of planting a number of years ago. Since we know this is very deflective of deer, we've put them there, and it seems to help, but also the persimmon doesn't need it. Now on the other side of that, here is English walnut, which up until recently seemed to be uninteresting to deer, but got absolutely chewed on even though there's black currant here. So it's not a silver bullet. These are just deflectors and helpers. But if the species selection is wrong, you can't do black currant around a bunch of really delicious apples and peaches and expect the deer to not eat them. But a little bit of a bumper to keep them off the persimmon while they're getting started, and now they're up and above, and I have nothing more to worry about there. Here we are out on the west end of the property, pretty darn wet part of the landscape. You can see elecampane reigning supreme in the herbaceous layer, channels to drain it all periodically, and there's a character that repeats quite a bit out on this far end of the landscape. So this is one of the more open, sunnier glades in the land, and also quite obviously exposed to the same amount of deer as everywhere else, and it's seaberry or sea buckthorn. Look at all that vegetation that's perfectly at deer browse height. Everything through here could be nibbled by deer. They just do not. So this one is an older variety. It's a smaller, more plentiful fruit that crops late. Cerola we just added in this year. That's a more modern cultivar. It doesn't matter. Seems like all seaberry, all sea buckthorn is just about as rock solid deer proof as any plant's gonna get. So you're looking at a space through here with luscious, uninterrupted growth, laden with fruit, yastaberry, black currants. There's a bunch of thorny blackberries throughout, and then seaberry later on. And where we want to add trees that we care about that deer can browse, we have to put rings around them at this point or flank them in a ton of bamboo. We're happy to do that. But this landscape that you're seeing here is an example of about as passive of a planting setup with tons and tons of yield that the deer can move through but not interrupt. That was a lot. Hope that was useful to some of you folks. I am quite confident in the comments I'm going to have some people that say, you listed X, Y, or Z, and I've seen deer eat them. I'm sure that that's true. I'm giving you our own subjective experience in this landscape, central New York, but with about a little shy of 20 years of doing this sort of planting with that exposure to deer and seeing characters here at our smaller half-acre spot, at an older spot that's not too far from here. These characters seem to pan out as being really legitimately good at keeping deer away and just making crops for themselves. So let's continue the discussion in the comments. Let me know what you think I've got wrong. Let me know what I've missed. Maybe there's some characters that are really amazing, food, medicine-bearing, woody perennials that we should consider for cool, temperate climates. Thanks for watching.